So the topic today is art and the brain, and you know, we do have a Gulf Coast Florida Art Association here, and there's a Coach Poppy who runs that, and she often comes here. I'm sorry she's not here today, but we do have art and music therapy that we offer our patients, and in the last few weeks I've issued several scripts for art music therapy and also meditation, because I think these are very, very underused therapies for the brain. They're very ancient circuits, much more ancient than language. There's been a lot of research recently in art and its relationship to brain function and how we can use it as a therapy. And before we say that if there's one thing that distinguishes humans from animals, it's our ability to perform art. Well, we don't even know about that because of the bowerbird. Anybody seen the bowerbird in Australia? You seen it? What did you see?
It's one of the PBS serial. So they put the all these decorations.
So these are incredible displays of artistic ability by these birds, and these nests can be up to 8 feet tall, and they assemble all sorts of brightly colored objects and flowers and sometimes bits of glass and junk, but anyway, they think it's beautiful. What we do know is that art is ubiquitous amongst all societies all over the world. And it's generally recognized by the researchers today that there is an evolutionary advantage to be able to make art. And it must have factored into our survival as humans. The oldest art that we have evidence of are the Franco-Cantabrian caves in Altamira in Spain and Lascaux in France, and there's several in France. And the art that has been found in those caves has been likened to the best that has ever been found in the medieval times, such as Michelangelo's art. A very good book called The Art Instinct by Dennis Dutton, who is a art philosopher. I think he's in New Zealand. Really is a very, very good treatise of what we think the function of art is for the human brain. That gives us an evolutionary advantage. It enabled us to communicate things between people, and it certainly enabled us to communicate long before we had language. So we did it in an imagistic manner, much that some of you today do with the Imagines on your iPhones. Now, it's not just visual arts that we need to be concerned about, but also music and performing art. And of course, what we conveniently left out is the art relating to the other senses, such as taste and smell. Now, I was told the other day that there's a huge amount of information about the human neurobiology of sense of smell by French perfume companies, but it's all classified information, and which I can believe. They make a lot of money out of it. But the sense of taste, of course, is the domain of culinary abilities, and that is a well-known artistic performance I think that many of us forget about. Now, the reason why we like art is because it challenges our brains. When you look at a piece of art, what we think is happening is it intellectually challenges our brain circuitry. Obviously, some art much more than others, but you'll see later I have a very interesting slide from Eric Kandel, who is a Nobel Prize winner in physiology and medicine, who tried to delineate the number of different neurotransmitter systems and circuits that are triggered by looking at an important piece of art or something worthwhile looking at. So art stretches our ability to put things together, to make sense of what we're seeing, and sometimes it's difficult, but it certainly challenges us. It also makes us imagine things. It triggers our imagination. And if there's one thing where art is different to anything else that people do, such as watching football games or engaging in sport, visual art triggers our imaginative experiences, which is something very, very critical for our survival. Because if we cannot imagine where we might be in the future, how a hunting expedition might go, we are probably doomed to fail. So it's an important function that developed within our brains. And this leads us to thought experiments. Through imagination, we perform thought experiments on how best to act in a simple thing like a hunting experiment, but also in an interaction between people, which are probably our biggest challenges of all. Is how do we cope with that particular person? How do we negotiate and so forth? So these are the kind of things that art exercises our brain to enable us to perform better at these functions. Now, there was an interesting exercise performed by two Russian artists, Komar and Melamed, who emigrated to the United States, I think 20, 30 years ago. And they tried to figure out, seeing that art is universal amongst all cultures, what are the different cultures like in art? What are preferred paintings? And for France, the most ideal kind of painting that the majority of these people who were sampled came up with was a scene. It wasn't a face or an object, it was a particular landscape scene that had a lot of blue in it, it had water in it, it was a pretty landscape scene, if you like. Okay, that's France. This is Germany. Again, a landscape. Notice a lot of blue in it. Iceland, landscape with a lot of blue, with a lot of water. China, same thing. Italy, not sure what, there probably is a landscape here, but again, notice the predominance of blue. Kenya, again, landscape, water, a lot of blue. Russia, same things. Turkey, same thing. United States, similar. And these are the things that people most abhorred. They were also asked, what is the worst kind of painting that you could imagine? And this is what they came up with. Basically, all geometric shapes, different kinds of colors, a lot of red and black. And I've listed the countries that it refers to. So you can see that what people really like to see is this kind of thing. They like to see landscapes, and they like to see water, and they like to see the color blue. And people have, or researchers have, correlated this with our evolutionary past, that we grew up in the African Rift Valley, which consisted of very pretty landscape, a lot of mountains and valleys, and a lot of rivers, lakes, and the color blue. Now, you might think that this is all theoretical, and I'm not a philosopher, I'm a clinician. And this is why I show you this picture, because one day I saw a relatively young woman in her 30s or 40s, and she was referred for a dementing syndrome, even though she was that young. And she once told me that she spends her weekends putting these candle stands on display. And she sells quite a lot of them. And I said, why don't you send me a picture or bring one in so I can see it? And this is what she did. And she had the most amazing ability in painting these candle stands, if you like, whatever they were. But she made a lot of money out of this because she was so good. So I was particularly impressed by her artistic ability. And I've seen many, many other people with dementia or mild cognitive impairment that had the most incredible artistic ability. It may be paintings, it could be sculptures. So you wonder, why would artistic ability be so important in today's therapies, or even in neurology and diagnostics and monitoring? Well, if you look at our overall evolution of the human brain, once we had the sensory motor connections sorted out, which evolved in the trees, we were able to improve our working memory capacity, which was the foundation of all your high cognitive functions. So if you likened it to a search engine of your computer, that's what our working memory is. It's able to integrate all our other higher cognitive functions. And once you're able to do that, you can connect them much better, And that's where you get your creativity, imagination from, and also consciousness. So all our different cognitive abilities, such as language, technical, social, natural history, all of a sudden you can integrate these and make use of them for new purposes. And this obviously gave us a major evolutionary advantage. And the very first thing is our biggest challenge was not so much the environment and the predators we faced, it was the interpersonal relationship with other people. And the leading thinkers of the Franco-Cantabrian art, which there's one example of the bison, a famous picture of the bison from Spain, Altamira, was that these were representations of different alliances amongst groups. They tried to convey thoughts, perspectives, alliances that they had with other people. Remember, there was no language in those days. Now that's 30,000, 40,000 years ago, but perhaps the oldest form of art was found in the southern African caves, Roskamp Cave, almost 80,000 years ago. So this is the oldest archaeological evidence that we have. And of course the oldest evidence we have of executive function, which is a direct consequence of our improved working memory capacity, was the lion man, which was discovered in southern Germany 33,000 years ago. It is on display at the Ulm Museum. Now, I recently got permission to use this picture in my upcoming book, Brainbeat, from the Ulm Museum, at a very low cost of 65 euros. So they're very responsive to allowing people to use this image, which is often been called the most important artifact that we've ever found in relation to human beings. How did we first begin to make art? Now, David Lewis Williams wrote this wonderful book called The Mind in the Cave, and his theory was, and has been accepted by, I think, everyone who deals in this game, is that it started off by normal hallucinatory experiences that people have. For example, that you have when you fall asleep. You can have somatic, sensory, what's called hypnagogic experiences where you suddenly fall. That's quite normal. You also have a lot of hallucinations when you dream. Those are visual hallucinations. But you can also trigger them by incessant drumming, jumping up and down, dancing, fasting. A lot of things can trigger hallucinations. And people used to do this. A lot of primitive, or better called not primitive, but traditional societies spend days sometimes dancing so that they can transform their minds into these hallucinatory experiences. And then people can go through different stages. They see much more elementary visual hallucinations, such as that starry shaped figure over there, or these crescentic lines, or what's called navicular shapes, which means boat. And you might recall that people that had migraine attacks, they see these all the time. So this is a normal brain experience that anybody can have, and you get these simple shape hallucinations. But you can, of course, so these are the kind of triggers to the hallucinations. You can get them from meditation, you can get them from prolonged drumming, what's called audio driving, flashing lights, rhythmic dancing, fatigue, fasting, pain, and of course psychotropic drugs. They may take the form, if you look at the extreme left image, they may take the form of simple shapes, zigzag lines, dots, grids, or they may start becoming a little bit more complex. And in stage 3, you see that they usually take the form of different animals and sometimes even people, and scenes and landscapes and so forth. So this is a normal brain function that you can have such experiences. So at some stage, people obviously got to painting their experiences of much like dream therapy does. It's, you know, like Salvador Dali, he used to paint his dreams, and he's famous for that. But you may not only have visual hallucinations, you may also have somatic hallucinations, where you have prickling on your skin or things crawling on your skin, and some of you may remember that that's what DTs and alcoholics have. They say that there's things crawling all over their skin. And this piece of cave art from southern Africa was initially thought to be a very violent scene, giving you objective evidence how savage and cruel people used to be and what they used to do to each other, to spear their fellow man full of these it used to impale him. But this, of course, is not what this picture shows. This is representative of somatic hallucinations. It was reinterpreted about 100 years later after that initial interpretation. And a lot of Southern African art forms, again researched by Lewis Williams, show you pictures of animals, because the animal-human relationship was very, very tight for most of our evolution. And a lot of the pictures have birds in them, birds on a stick, or people with wings on them, because the idea was that when you had hallucinations, you used to ascend somewhere into the sky, from the cave into the sky. So they had this concept of above and below. This is a picture of a falling horse. Can you see that? There's the horse's head, there's his ears, there's his front legs, and there's his body. A horse falling into a vortex, because as you start experiencing your first hallucinations, people typically, those that have had near-death experiences, for example, or even with migraine or seizure attacks, you feel like you're going through a spiral, through a vortex. And this is what has been attempted to be displayed by this image in the caves. So Jean-Claude Cottis is kind of the world expert with David Lewis Williams on cave art, and he's written a wonderful book called Cave Art. And between the two of them, they've come up with a lot of interpretations of what is the best explanations of some of these pictures. Now, you might argue with it, but I would take it up with them, not with me. So this is a diagram illustrating the genesis of the first kind of art forms. They took place in dark caves, number one, because people tried to make the connection between the underground and the above. And the spirit world is above, and this is the vortex that people go through when they experience a hallucination. And depending on what stage they're in, stage 1, 2, or 3, they may or may not paint these. And we think that most of the cave art was painted by shamans. So when you have altered states of consciousness, not only may you have these visual hallucinations, but you may have somatic ones, you may have gustatory ones, you may have olfactory ones. All sorts of things can hallucinate. Any of your senses, of which you have 5, can hallucinate. Just to give you some idea of the unbelievable art that has been found in these caves. I don't know if anybody's been to them, France or Spain. I haven't been either, but I would like to go. It's worth seeing. It's as good as going to Italy, they say. These are the bison from Spain. It's meant to portray some kind of alliance. This is using 3-dimensional art. This is a bull looking at you. Here's his eyes. There's his nose. And in many of these caves, there were objects placed in clefts in the cave wall, and that was interpreted as trying to communicate with your spirits or your ancestors, or the people that live above from those who live below. So a form of communication with with those who have gone, with those who don't exist on the planet. The roaring stag, here's his head, here's his horns. They think that some kind of music tradition or music festival was held in these deep dark caves together with these images. Now, another thing that can happen in the human brain is when you trigger hallucinations in the visual area, it can transform over to the sensory area and can even go over into the emotional areas. So that's called synesthesia. So the senses can link up with each other. And here's one of the more complex images that were found in one of the caves. Venka, do you have any idea of what this means? There's a bison that's been speared with its bowels hanging out, and it looks like there's a dead man with a bird's head. Bird's head, bird on a stick. Again, when this was first discovered, it was interpreted as a hunting experience gone wrong. But what it really means is the people at the time, their concept of the afterlife, is that when there was death, all right, as portrayed by this bison and this human, people used to ascend up into the sky, into the afterlife. And that's why birds who fly in the sky are always part of such a scene. So when you see a bird of the head, that's what we think it means. And combining a lion's body or a man's body with a lion's head, this is a kind of totemism or anthropomorphism, if you like. This is the first evidence we have of our working memory, our operating system, if you like, when it really came to unite all our different higher cognitive functions for the first time, that we could combine different disciplines within our brain. So we had this intraconnectivity. And of course now we do the same thing between people and between countries, and we do this via the internet. So we've gone from intraconnectivity to interconnectivity. And this is only 32,000 years ago that we have the first evidence how our brains connected all the different parts. And it's only at this time that we first developed language. So what can we say about art and neuroscience? I think I've tried to show you the evidence we have so far that this is a very ancient circuit. It served very, very important functions. It had useful purposes. It promoted our survival. It was a form of communication, initially imagistic, not verbal. And again, Eric Kandel, who is a Nobel Prize winner in medicine, as I mentioned, he wrote a wonderful book called The Age of Insight, where he investigated the neuroscience that he was familiar with and how does it relate to the famous artists that he grew up with at the turn of the century in Vienna, such as Rokitansky and Klimt and many others, which I'll show you pictures of. So Kokoschka, for example, concentrated on facial and hand gestures, and I'll show you some examples of that. Scheele through body postures, and Klimt were very much influenced by Freud's ideas of brain functioning. And here's a picture by Kokoschka, for example, showing you facial expression and hand postures of somebody who clearly had a mild stroke, the mild facial asymmetry and the hand function like this. Very, very cleverly demonstrated. And this picture I'll show you later was sold for $125 million. Now you wonder why people would pay so much for art, and there's an explanation for that as well. So another portrait of somebody looking anxious, facial expression and hand posturing. And this is Scheele's body posturing, again conveying some kind of human emotion, human attitude, whatever you want to call it, that you can communicate that between people just by the way you paint it. This painting is called Cheat with the Ace of Diamonds. And you can see that the woman looks a little bit suspicious of what's going on. She's trying to mind read. This, of course, is a function of the mirror neurons. That is a brain circuit that we have. It's been developed to a much higher extent in us as opposed to our nearest relatives, such as chimpanzees, our living relatives. Remember, our nearest relative were the Neanderthals, but they don't exist anymore. Or Homo ergaster, who also doesn't exist anymore. But mirror neurons allow us to figure out what you might be thinking about me, and what I might be thinking about you, and what your next intention might be. That's mirror neurons. And that can have several levels of complexity. And this painting is trying to demonstrate that. She's trying to figure out what is that person really up to. And remember that we commonly preach based on some pretty good evidence that 3/4 of communication is nonverbal. So what we say through language is one thing, but what we portray through our body postures, our facial expressions and so forth might say something completely different. And that's why we have to meet face to face, and that's why Facebook isn't everything. So I wonder what you thought of Eric Kandel's interpretation of this famous picture called Judith. Judith was somebody who managed to seduce a king called Holofernes. This is a biblical story. And anyway, they decapitated Holofernes because of her abilities, and she holds his decapitated head, bottom right-hand corner. And this is a famous painting, and according to Eric Kandel from New York, famous neuroscientist, he thinks that the following half a dozen neurotransmitter systems, highlighted in red, are triggered by looking at this picture in the following way. Now, each of these neurotransmitter systems subserve a different function. Dopamine gives you alertness, helps with memory. Norepinephrine, again, an attentional kind of neurotransmitter. It also is a neurotransmitter that gets released when you are in a scary situation. But things like serotonin get stimulated by looking at something beautiful, which could be the gold, it could be a painting. And so it goes. Endorphins are also released. Endorphins and anandamide, for example, are things that are released not only by paintings but also by physical exercise and give you the so-called runner's high. So these are neurochemicals that have very powerful influences on our brains. And of course they may be much more marked when you take drugs, or they can be a little bit more subtle but still very effective when you do intensive exercise or listen to a good piece of music or meditate, for example. And the emotional and social brain has an extensive circuitry, and these are the key hubs that are involved. So you can see that when you look at paintings, you exercise in your brain. It's a good cognitive exercise. Now, Ramachandran from the University of San Diego, he wrote the book called The Telltale Brain. Has anybody read it? It's really good. Hi, John. Hi. And one of the things I liked about his book is he's one of the few people who tried to explain neuroscientifically what happens in our brains when we view art and why people find it pleasurable to look at some art and maybe are disgusted looking at other kinds of art. But anyway, when you look at good art, he's explained it in the following way. These are the kind of evolutionary circuits that are responsible for us having aesthetic pleasure at looking at art, for example. And these are his 9 rules. Now, we don't have time to go through all of these, but I'll discuss a few of them. For example, the first one is called grouping. So grouping relates to the fact that just think that you're a person born 50,000 years ago, and you're running through a forest, could be anywhere, and you see a kind of a yellow shape here. And what do you think this yellow shape is? You only see little bits and pieces of it. Your brain very, very rapidly puts these little blotches of yellow together and says, this is a lion. And this is important significance to me. But you don't see the whole lion, you just see parts of it. But you group it together and say, oh, this is a problem. And he uses the example that when you go and shop at Nordstrom, not you, but you, the sales representative will sell you this red skirt and say, and here, match this red scarf with the red skirt, please. It really goes well. And this is the underlying reason why this matching business works. Okay? Do you buy that? Ladies amongst? Anyway, we do this all the time. When people frame a picture, they say, use this blue background because it brings out the blue in the picture. This is the grouping effect. And the second rule that he came up was peak shift. Our brains respond to exaggerated stimuli. And if you remember the cartoons or caricatures of Nixon, where they exaggerate his nose and his bushy eyebrows, it makes him look more like Nixon than the real Nixon. Because that's how our brains work, is they respond to these exaggerated stimuli. And so the same thing happens in birds. This is the herring seagull that Tinbergen first described, where the chicklets tap on the mother's beak because they see this red dot. If you make a very much bigger red dot or red stripes, they respond even more forcefully. And it's thought to be nature's way of taking shortcuts into identifying important, say, food sources for the seagull. And that's why caricatures work for our brains. And a lot of these line drawings are also part of the cave art that I showed you earlier on. And an interesting example he gave of peak shift was this nymph that was found in India, southern India, is a triple flexion of the optimal female shape of big breasts, wide hips, and a flexion of the neck and the body that's been called Trabanga. And it's meant to superactivate our mirror neurons in the visual part of the brain. And interestingly, he cited examples that a lot of dance routines, no matter where you look in the world, use these flex. Have you seen this, Venkat, in India? No?
It's pretty common that in several temples. Not
All right.
exactly the same, but more exaggerated.
Yeah.
Women postures.
So these postures convey specific emotions, and our brains respond to these things. Now, it has been identified in the brain, this is for Dr. Rees, sitting in the back, that we can figure out where in the brain the circuits become more active when we look at aesthetic pieces of art. And one of the most important regions was the orbitofrontal cortex, which is this area over here. This is the underside of the brain, and this is the front. So the orbitofrontal cortex is particularly activated by looking at impressive art, the neuroaesthetic circuit, if you like. And when there's more visual things going on, that he called, in his experiment, perceptual brightness, so contrast and color, then you have different circuits being activated, such as the more lateral side of the prefrontal cortex and the premotor area. They're quite different. So we've gone to we've done a tour of a lot of the neurobiology and the evidence we have, the archaeological evidence of art and so forth. But how does this help us with people that we might see in the clinic? Or how could you help yourself, no matter whether you're young or you're old? How can you improve your brain function? Is this a cognitive exercise that you should all be engaged in? The answer is yes, from the evidence we have. First of all, art creativity can be improved by illness. It can suddenly become tremendously good, even though you've had a major stroke or you've actually been diagnosed with dementia. So that's one thing we see. It can also be preserved when the rest of the brain is deteriorating, like with dementia. And it's particularly so when the frontal lobes and the temporal lobes degenerate. So we see it more often with what's called frontotemporal lobe degeneration or dementia than with any other kind of dementia. But even with Alzheimer's dementia, which is the other side of the brain, right at the back, even then people can do the most amazing paintings, even at a stage when they can hardly speak and they cannot recognize their spouse. So you can see that there's a huge amount of evidence in support of these being very ancient brain circuits, and the same applies to music. Music is also a very ancient brain circuit, much more so than our language ability, for example. We all worry about language, but that was one of the latest developments we had. So these are a lot of different brain conditions, syndromes. In all of these, artistic ability has been shown to increase and sometimes hold out much longer than the rest of the brain, which ages. And sometimes we can also use artistic ability to monitor brain illness. Take, for example, this report from Bruce Miller, who does wonderful work in frontotemporal lobe dementia at UCSF. He had this patient with frontotemporal lobe dementia who was completely aphasic, could no longer speak, but yet she could paint this picture. Now, one of the things that people with frontotemporal lobe dementia have is the first thing that goes is they lose their social decorum. They do inappropriate things, they're disinhibited, they don't do well in society, although they can pass neuropsychological tests quite well, but they behave sometimes very badly. And it can vary. Sometimes they behave well and sometimes not. And one of the things that some of them have described is that, or their clinicians have described, is that they make strange facial expressions. It's called the alien stare syndrome. So they'll sit at home or they sit in public or at dinner, they make the most amazing grimacing faces for no reason, and it's been termed the alien stare syndrome. And this is one such patient who was an artist who painted himself in the years that he had this frontotemporal lobe dementia. You can see that he started off painting a fairly normal person up here, and then as his disease progressed, so did the features of his face deteriorate into the final one that he drew, such as this one. Now, some people have this cross-modal ability so that sound or color will stimulate other senses or even emotions. And this was well described in one report, I think it's by somebody called Schrott. When she felt happy, she painted bright, warm colors, scenes in orange, yellow, and red. And when she was depressed, she painted things in blue. And there was this very tight correlation between the kind of paintings that she gave her clinicians and what she felt, because they're trying different medications on her, and some would work and some would not work. So I think I've shown you pictures of lesions in the brain in the past. When you lesion one part of the brain, it doesn't mean that that's the function that has been affected, lives in that part of the brain. You have to think of the brain as a very, very complex network, that you can have a lesion here, but the effects could be felt at the opposite end of the brain. And that is a principle called diaskesis, and it's because the brain has 100,000 miles of fiber networks within your head, which is 4 times around the world. So these extensive fiber tracts sometimes allow another part of the brain to decrease in function or increase in function. The artistic associations that you see in disease of the brain are particularly the frontal and temporal lobe. But there are other parts. Remember, there's many parts. There's always hubs. It's best to think of hubs being involved. And the orbitofrontal lobe is one of the hubs that has to do with artistic appreciation and ability. And there's an important principle called paradoxical functional facilitation. And this is why children, for example, that have had their whole left hemisphere removed because of intractable seizures, sometimes become savants. Sometimes they then develop amazing mathematical ability, calendar counting. The one child was taken on a trip over London by helicopter, and he could then paint every single building that he saw, just from memory. Other children have tremendous musical ability, and they hear a complex symphony once and then able to play it on the piano immediately. So these are savant abilities that can happen in the context of severe brain injury. So much so that their so-called IQ is way below normal. Now, when we refer people for art therapy, this is where my abilities wane, because I'm not an art therapist, but we do have people in Sarasota, for example, who are art therapists, and they will administer the therapies according to and the testing according to a particular regimen. And there's various kinds of art therapies. For example, you get people to do face painting, to paint a story, and they look at the abilities, and they look at the emotions expressed in the pictures. And then, of course, they can use the art therapy not only to monitor, but also as a tool to improve brain functions, particularly in the following conditions, such as ADHD. It's been extensively used in post-traumatic stress disorder, autism, addiction therapy, and emotional physical abuse. And I thought this was a wonderful example, published recently, the mask painting that they use for soldiers with PTSD in Washington. So these are instances where language has great difficulty in expressing what these soldiers feel, but they are able to express this much, much better in the form of mask painting. And I thought I would close with giving you this example and why this painting sold for $125 million. Anybody know the reason? Why would anybody pay so much for a picture? The original was sold for this amount. I'm not the expert on this. Somebody in the crowd must be an expert.
There's an article about this painting in this morning's Wall Street Journal.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
Well, how timely.
It was stolen by the Nazis from. This is a picture of the woman's aunt, a woman who has gotten it back and sold it to Lauder, sued the holders of it. I don't remember who was holding it, but it had been stolen by the Nazis. And it was a painting of this the woman's aunt, who's now 81 years old. Her aunt was the subject. I don't recall why they said it was painted, honestly.
Yeah, so the best explanation I came up with was from Dutton, who's the art philosopher I mentioned earlier, who wrote a very, very interesting book called The Art Instinct. It's came out about 2 years ago. And he speaks of the peacock principle. And he says that the thing that bothered Darwin the most was the peacock. Now, a peacock has this tremendous demonstration of colored feathers, and Darwin could never understand why evolution would allow such a dramatic display of colors and feathers, and why would this peacock not get eaten by some predator? Because all the energy goes into this display of feathers. And how can they run away, for example? How can they fly properly? And so this, for many years, Darwin could not explain the existence of a peacock. All right? This was his great dilemma. And the theory of not natural selection but sexual selection then explained this better. But not only is natural selection important, but so is sexual selection. So gender selection, if you like. And the peacock, if he has fine feathers, will attract a fine female. It's as simple as that. And you do exactly the same when you buy your fiance a big diamond ring, or a fancy painting, or you drive a fancy car. You are demonstrating sexual selection. You are trying to attract by whatever means, even though the diamond is a worthless piece of equipment. It doesn't do anything for anyone. But it demonstrates that you have certain abilities. And the same thing applies to the hand axes that were found. Do you remember the very first stone tools that we made? Anybody remember that? First they were flakes of stone, and then people made a much more symmetrical piece of stone that looked like it's called a hand axe, like a dagger. Very symmetrical, very finely manufactured, and sometimes in magnificent colored stones. And interesting, most of those hand axes that were found all over the world were never damaged. They never seem to have been used, and we think that they were used as a kind of means to advertise the male's ability in hunting, prowess, strength, or whatever. So that's the peacock principle. Thank you. I'll keep quiet with that. Any questions? So?
All the way back to the beginning,
Yes.
I think it was when you were talking about the Lion Man, you made a flat statement saying, and they didn't have language at the time.
How do we know that?
Could you, yeah, how do you know that? I can say that they don't have written language, but how did you know they didn't have language?
Yeah, the Coolidge and Wynne, they work out of University of Colorado Springs. They've done most of the work, and they say that the evidence from the archaeological evidence that we found to date do not support that we had language until somewhere between 30 and 50,000 years ago. So it was about that time.
That was
Was it about that time that language emerged? And we think that executive function, what's called enhanced working memory, and language and this art all developed very suddenly at the same time. So let me clarify that was a process that kind of all happened at the same time.
Did not have language.
Yeah.
Now you're saying.
Well, no, I
they
meant
made
the art. The art. The fancy art preceded that. Remember the first art?
The Lion Man.
No, the Lion Man is the first evidence of executive function.
Okay.
But the cave art preceded all of this. And that, for that reason, imagistic as opposed to language communication was thought to be the reason for it. It's quite a long, complicated story about piecing it together, because you have to piece together archaeology and neurophysiology.
I just got one brief comment,
Mhm.
and that is, you built us up in 3/4 of this to say we should try anew to develop artistic function, artistic creativity, all these good things, and then you eviscerated and killed it by saying, if we have any artistic ability, it's demonstration that we have dementia. No,
it just shows you that it is a very robust circuit.
Yeah, but I'm saying. All right.
And it can survive dementia. I'm saying the opposite.
Well, you said that people with these problems have enhanced.
Oh yes, you can.
Their artistic ability.
Absolutely.
So now when I find that I'm better at art than I thought, I'm going to have to say.
No, it doesn't mean you're mental. But that's been described as that, like the children who have the operations, all of a sudden they become savants. Now, the next question that a lot of people pose is, can we not all become savants? Can we not just tickle our brains somewhere? And the answer is probably yes, through transcranial magnetic stimulation. And that's already been shown, is that you can enhance certain brain functions by buzzing the brain, by tickling it, if you like, with magnetism. And TMS is something that's been proven to be effective in depression, for example, and also improve working memory. John?
Michael, thank you for a fascinating tour through this very complex area.
Thank you.
I'm very stimulated in many different thought lines by what you presented. One of the things that I've read is that what is it about art that makes it good as therapy, and why do we like art? And one of the theories I've read is that, well, when we look at the world, like when I'm standing here, I make a picture of this room, I make a visual representation of the bouncing light, and I create it into a picture, and I'm creating a picture when I do that. That's not really reality so much as it's my representation of reality. Now art can occur when the artist dissociates themselves a little bit from some of the bounced off light that they're receiving in one way, and maybe receives input in another way, or even creates their own input and colors it a slightly different way. But in a way, art is a different way of representing reality. But it's very related to the way, to what we call reality. In other words, that there's more of a spectrum between art and reality.
Yes.
And that in the pathologic state, there's ways in which we can retrieve brain functions and exercise new brain functions by realizing that we are always representing reality in one way or the other. And art is just one way, and perhaps in a slightly different way, that we're representing reality.
Yeah, that's well put, John. Thank you. That's exactly what happens in the brain, is that it sometimes transcends reality.
It's fascinating.
Go.
And in so doing, strengthens the capacity of the brain to anticipate and deal with new situations.
Yes, absolutely. That's why it had survival value. That's why people that... So one of the theories that the Neanderthals had no art. So here's another support. There's many lines of support for the question you had earlier. When did language come? Now, the Neanderthals allegedly did not have language. They made music, but not language. And they did not have art. So that's one of the several reasons that are argued that, i.e., so language happened sometime between 30 and 40,000 years ago. Question at the back?
Is the red color different than the blue color?
I don't know. I mean, that's what happened in this particular patient. But remember the best paintings all over the world all were blue. Remember that? And we think it had a lot to do... we think it had a lot to do with... We like water scenes. We like the color blue because of the water. Anybody read the book, The Blue Mind? It came out 6 months ago. It's worth reading. It's about this very close association that we have with water. We love water. We want water lots. We like going to the ocean. So?
The transcranial magnetic
Stimulation.
Can you say a little bit more about that? That's something I hadn't heard
Yeah,
before. I haven't heard it used really.
It's magnetism, low intensity magnetism. And there's two forms. Now there's a direct current stimulation, which is an even milder form and has far less side effects. Not that the first one had many side effects. It's very safe. And it's been used to wake people up from a coma, for example. It's used in depression. It's used in chronic pain. And it's been approved by the FDA for depression, actually. And you can actually, depending on what frequency you dial in, you can make your limb go weak, or you can revive a limb that has been weakened by a stroke and make it stronger because of this network ability of the brain. When you lesion the brain, it decreases function in some parts, increases in others. So it's an interesting tool that we're just discovering now and starting to use. But you know, it takes time for all these clinical studies to be done and to show that it's safe. But it's looking very promising. TMS and TDCS. Those are the two.
Sounds like in between bioenergetics and electric acupuncture.
Yeah, maybe. Got you?
I know somebody who cannot daydream. Like they cannot visualize anything. When they want to imagine something, this person is also an author, but when she wants to imagine something, she describes everything with words. So she says, oh, I imagine a city, there's a lot of mountains. It's a very detailed verbal description of the place, so she cannot imagine. When I Googled this, I found that only a few cases where people had some injury to somewhere in their brain. That's why they couldn't imagine. They were able to imagine it before. I saw a case of an architect who was able to imagine, three-dimensional spaces, and after his stroke, he stopped imagining that. Is this like some people without any injury? Is it possible that they cannot daydream? They cannot imagine things visually?
Yes, it's also been described with inability to dream.
Okay.
So you also get those people. They're otherwise normal. Well, we think there could be a biochemical circuit abnormality.
But that will be like a fitness issue, many
Yeah.
thousands of years ago.
It would be a
according to
fitness
what
issue.
you said today, because they couldn't imagine, if there was also no language, really, they couldn't put what they saw in the jungle that day and come back home and
That's right.
remember it visually. Okay.
It could be a cortical migration defect that just happened to hit that particular circuit in the brain where you can't imagine things properly.
But there is no name, like a certain, name for that condition.
There is. There is in relation to in being unable to dream.
Okay,
If you give me a few seconds, I'll think of it.
okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for listening.